if you're someone who's around the same age as me, a child of the 1970s, as it were, 28 January is a day that always sticks out on the calendar, since it was on this day, 36 years ago now, hard as that is to believe, when Space Shuttle Challenger, 73 seconds after the launch of mission STS-51L, experienced a structural failure which caused a catastrophic breakup of the vehicle, resulting in the loss of all 7 crew members. And the reason people my age remember that event so vividly is because many of us were watching the launch on live TV in our school classrooms, though I am not part of that cohort, regrettably, but more on that in a moment. One of the 7 crew members, of course, was New Hampshire high school history teacher Christa Mcauliffe, who had been chosen to be the first non-astronaut in space, and by the time of the launch, she had been a major national celebrity for upwards of 6 months, and everybody loved her because she obviously was a very fine young woman, and there was nothing about her not to love. I have difficulty identifying with people who are seemingly in a perpetual state of smiling and happiness, whom everyone enjoys being around, but Christa Mcauliffe was one of those people. I don't know who was in charge of casting the role, whether it was NASA or the White House or some combination of the two, but they really hit it out of the park when they selected that girl. But I guess when the president is a former Hollywood actor, it stands to reason that they would get the casting calls right. There were actually 2 big announcements that were made regarding the civilian in space project, though everybody tends to forget the first one, when President Reagan announced that it would be a teacher who got the first ride, and then they spent 7 or 8 months winnowing down the pool of candidates from 20,000 down to 10. Then they had the 10 finalists. This all would have made a great reality TV show if it was 20 years later. And then later came the more famous announcement, the one in which Vice President Bush deputized for Reagan, who was called away on some emergency or other, where the 10 of them stood there, and Mcauliffe was announced as the winner of the sweepstakes, with Barbara Morgan as her backup. Barbara Morgan, who became an honest-to-God NASA astronaut in her own right 20 years after the Challenger disaster, and flew on board Space Shuttle Endeavour on mission STS-118, one of the space station construction missions. So, to put it a different way, 20 years after she was the runner-up for the Teacher in Space contest, she became the first teacher in space, not because she won a casting call, but because she was Barbara Morgan, fully qualified NASA astronaut, and legit badass. There was a massive PR campaign built up around Christa Mcauliffe after the announcement of her selection, probably the biggest PR blitz in NASA's history. And part of the scheme was convincing schools to let kids watch the launch on TV, as well as the 2 lessons from space that she was scheduled to conduct on the 3rd and 7th days of the mission. And a lot of schools, probably more than half the schools in the country, took them up on the offer. So when the orbiter wound up disintegrating in a giant ball of fiery death, it was being watched by a larger TV audience than had watched any space flight-related event since Neil and Buzz touched down on the moon on Apollo 11, which was 17 years earlier, and the vast majority of them were impressionable young children for whom these images would wind up being indelibly seared into their subconscious for life. After the disaster, the civilians in space program was quietly dropped, and right up to the present day, no non-astronaut has ever flown on a NASA mission. But if there had been no Challenger disaster, they had big plans for civilians in space. It wasn't just going to be teachers. Teachers were only the first vocation that they happened to pick. They had plans for cops in space, doctors in space, plumbers in space, strippers in space, kids in space even. Yeah, you heard me right. NASA was actually going to fly children on the space shuttle, and they planned to do it right around 1990. That was part of the whole marketing blitz for the Challenger flight. We'll put a teacher in space, we'll have every kid in the country watch it on TV, and in order to maintain their interest level, we will even float the idea of putting kids in space. And so the thinking went that if you made every kid and every working class Tom, Dick, and Harry think they had a chance to win a ride on the space shuttle, then that would cause the interest level of the public at large and popular support of the space program to rocket back up to levels not seen since the early Apollo era. No pun intended. As I mentioned a couple moments ago, My school was not one of the ones where the kids got to watch the launch on live TV. I was in 7th grade in January of '86, or grade 7 for our Canadian viewers. I was attending a private parochial school, and we had Bible study class, first period on Tuesdays and Thursdays, where the regular teacher would leave the room and the pastor would come in and teach Bible study for an hour. We had made it known to the administration that we would very much like to be able to watch the launch, but the pastor was having none of it. You want me to skip a Bible study class so the kids can watch television? That's not going to happen. So while the disaster was taking place, we were busy studying 1 Corinthians chapter 20 or some such thing, so we didn't find out about the Challenger until the regular teacher had come back in the room at 9 o'clock to take over for the pastor, which was 20 or so minutes after the orbiter had broken up, and she had been watching the thing on TV in the faculty lounge, along with the administrators, so she was fully up to date, or as fully up to date as one can be 20 minutes after a major disaster in 1986, and she makes the announcement almost in passing, as if it's an afterthought, like she's ready to press on with the rest of the school day. And she just casually says, "Oh yeah, the space shuttle just blew up, and everybody died." As God is my witness, those were her actual words. And she didn't want to talk about it anymore after that. She became visibly annoyed that we 12-year-olds were probably going to have a difficult time focusing on our English lesson when we would like to have more information on the major national disaster that you have only told us one sentence about. It wound up being a fun case of civil disobedience and democracy in action, or mob rule as the case may be, because we all basically threw down our pencils, and we were like, nope, this is not happening. You're going to go down that hallway, you're going to get that damn television, you're going to wheel that thing in here, and we're all going to watch. And we're prepared to sit here not doing our schoolwork until hell freezes over until you meet our demands. Which they did. They eventually relented and brought the TV, and so we picked up the coverage about probably 40 minutes after the disaster had occurred, which is better than nothing. Now, how cruel would that have been? To make us sit there all day until 3 o'clock with no information except the space shuttle blew up and everybody died. There is much to learn from the Challenger disaster. There always will be. Because those 7 crew members, the 5 NASA astronauts, 1 payload specialist, 1 civilian joyrider, the seeds of their death were sown all the way back in the early 70s. And it was 1,000 different errors and miscalculations and acts of political expediency that all added up to their death sentence. From an incoherent mission architecture to a deeply flawed vehicle design to a bureaucracy that was all too happy to sacrifice crew safety on the altar of the desire to satisfy quotas and to meet impossible schedule requirements. In other words, since the date on the calendar confers such a convenient excuse tonight, I am going to bitch about how much I hate the stupid space shuttle, so hit the music, Jim Eagle. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where our preferred launch vehicles are the Catapult and the Trebuchet. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. Happy Friday. I am your eponymous host and humble servant. I hope your work week has reached an agreeable conclusion. And let's say we do this. Let's begin at the moment of the catastrophe and work our way backward from there to unravel as best we can within the time constraints of a single main segment the daisy chain of dumbassery and bureaucratic intransigence that culminated in the failure of mission STS-51L and the loss of the vehicle and crew. You will often hear people say that the Challenger exploded or blew up, but neither of those descriptors is correct. The proximal cause of the vehicle breakup was the failure of the aft strut on the right solid rocket booster. The booster loses its point of attachment to the external tank, which causes it to come loose, rotate counterclockwise, which creates dynamic loads on the vehicle far beyond the capability to withstand it. So the orbiter and the external tank disintegrate catastrophically within a matter of about 0.6 of a second, and the 2 SRBs remain intact and enter into a period of uncontrolled flight before they're ultimately destroyed by the range safety officer. The fireball that everybody sees is not the result of an explosion. It's a consequence of the external tank being breached and its contents then being ignited by the exhaust from the shuttle main engines. So why does the aft strut fail on that right-hand booster? This is the part of the story that most everybody knows. The strut failed because it got melted to shit by the rocket exhaust that was pouring out from the field joint between the 4th and 5th segments on the right-hand SRB. The exhaust was pouring out because the rubber O-ring that seals the joints between the booster segments was insufficiently elastic to seal the joint as it normally would, and it was insufficiently elastic because it wasn't rated to work in temperatures under 32 degrees Fahrenheit. When Challenger launched, the temperature in Cape Canaveral was 27 degrees. So that's it. Case closed, right? The flight had already been delayed 5 times. NASA management was under intense pressure to maintain a launch schedule that kept falling farther and farther behind. So the night before the launch, they called up Morton Thiokol, the contractor who makes the SRBs, and they said, "Look, fellas, you're really killing us with this 32 degrees thing. We think we can launch safely under 32 degrees. We just need your written assurance to that effect. So give it to us right now, or else we'll be happy to find another contractor to build these boosters." So it would seem we've got a cut and dried case here. Everybody knew there was severe danger, a mission-critical level of danger if you launched under 32 degrees, but the government strong-armed the civilian contractor into signing off on it against their better judgment. So there's plenty of recrimination to go around, but this is where the recriminations end, isn't it? No. In fact, that is not where the recriminations end, and not by a long shot. We've established that a failure in one of the solid rocket boosters caused the loss of the vehicle. So the reasonable next question to ask is this: why did the vehicle have solid rocket boosters? Why was that particular design chosen? Why did we choose to build a space vehicle that relied on what are basically 2 giant Roman candles where you have to just light them off and hope for the best? You can't throttle them down, you can't turn them off, you can't even safely separate the vehicle from them until they've expended their fuel and burned themselves out. They are 2 gigantic single points of failure. If one or the other does not function perfectly, you are guaranteed an LOVOC event. Loss of vehicle and crew. The answer to that question of why we were using these extremely dangerous boosters when we seemingly had other, better, safer options, that answer resides all the way back in 1972. The final 3 Apollo lunar missions have already been canceled. Apollo 17 is going to be the last one to fly, and NASA, under the direction of Congress, wants to take the money they've saved by canceling Apollos 18, 19, and 20 and use it for whatever we're going to do next. But there is no broad agreement on what that should be. You had some space hawks in the Congress who wanted to maintain NASA at its current funding level, which back then was 5% of the federal budget as opposed to 1% today. They wanted a space station, a moon base, and boots on Mars by 1990. But there were others in the Congress. Walter Mondale was their leader, who hated NASA, who didn't give 2 squirts of piss about space exploration. They considered the whole enterprise a colossal waste of money, and they wanted to be done with it. And yes, I know it sounds weird that there once were Democrats who wanted to downsize the federal government and spend less money, but it really is true. The first proposals for the vehicle that ultimately became the Space Shuttle, they had much more ambitious goals in mind, goals that were more congruent with the views of the congressional space hawks than they were with the Mondale crowd. As it was first proposed, the shuttle was going to be a sort of heavy-duty space truck that would be used to haul up the materials for building the space station and the moon base, and ultimately the vehicles that would take Americans to Mars by the close of the 20th century. As it was first envisaged, the shuttle orbiter was going to sit on top of a Saturn V first stage. You know, the Saturn V that is still, 50 years later, the best performing, most reliable heavy lift launch vehicle ever wrought by the hands of men. So the thinking went, since we already have the best launch vehicle anybody's ever built, why not keep using it? Why not take this already proven technology and adapt it to the future missions that we're going to be undertaking? Well, I'll tell you why. Because sensibility doesn't feed the bulldog. First off, Mondale and his buddies, they weren't having any of this space station, moon base, Mars mission stuff. So they put their foot down and said, all right, get rid of everything else, but we'll let you keep your little space truck. And that's it. And at this point, there was no longer any practical reason for building the shuttle, since the missions you were planning to use it for, they're no longer going to be funded. And besides, how the hell are we going to get Congress to approve an empty space truck that doesn't have much to do except putter around in low Earth orbit? For that matter, why do we want an empty space truck with no apparent mission? And this is where good old-fashioned pork barrel politics come into play. Because look, there might not be any practical reason for building this silly space truck, but by God, we're still going to build it, and we can get the votes for it in Congress. We just need to make the thing more complicated and more expensive. So forget about that modified Saturn V first stage. Why use a reliable vehicle we already have when we can build a much more dangerous one for 3 times as much? If we stick a couple of solid rocket boosters on this thing, that's a big fat contract from Morton Thiokol out in Utah, and that delivers us the votes of both Utah senators. And if we're not going to be using that Saturn first stage, we're going to need some place to put the fuel for the shuttle main engines, which means we're going to need a big external fuel tank. So that's a fat contract for Lockheed out in Maryland, and we won't have any trouble from their senators either. But even then, even when they had porked the thing up just as best as they could, the support in Congress was still softer than they would have liked. So the decision was taken, let's go after the Air Force. So NASA goes to Air Force leadership and they say, hey guys, we've got this big fancy space truck and nothing to put in it. So what do you say? You want to use it to launch your satellites? So they duly managed to secure a half-hearted agreement from the Air Force. Okay, I guess we're willing to occasionally use your silly space truck if the need should ever arise. And after 31 years of shuttle service, how many times did the need arise? Once. That is how many Air Force payloads flew on the shuttle. 1. And that was supposed to be the number one reason for building the shuttle after the kibosh got put on the space station and the moon base. So that's how it was sold to Congress and the public. And they flew 1 freaking payload. Now, among spaceflight enthusiasts today, there is no topic that will cause a flame war faster than the space shuttle. And it seems to be, strangely enough, sort of a generational divide for reasons I can't really figure out. Among people my age and older, there seems to be a consensus that it was a stupid vehicle with no real mission, with an ill-fated design that owed as much to politics as it did to engineering, and its overall benefit was negligible to non-existent. But among younger adults, for some bizarre reason, they seem to love the shuttle, and they sometimes take great umbrage at any criticism of it. But let's go to the tail of the tape, shall we? The shuttle fleet flew a grand total of 135 missions, 2 of which ended with loss of vehicle and crew. And how many things did it ever do that couldn't have been done by other launch vehicles that were in our inventory at the time? 1. The answer is 1. The only thing the shuttle ever did that only the shuttle could do was the launching and servicing of the Hubble Space Telescope. It's not correct to say we needed the shuttle for building the ISS because the Russians had to fly components for their portion of the station that were just as big and just as heavy as ours, and they managed just fine without any shuttle. We spent 30 years flying a vehicle that most of the time we were trying to invent things to do with it. Mostly we just puttered around in low Earth orbit. When the shuttle flew for the last time in 2011, we were no closer to realizing the goal of a moon base or a Mars mission than we were in 1972. Wernher von Braun had a workable plan for putting Americans on Mars by 1990 using only technologies we already had in the mid-70s, and if there had been the political will, we damn well could have done it. But we didn't even try. We should have had multiple permanent lunar outposts by the end of the 20th century. We have none. All we've got is a rickety old half-Russian space station that's starting to be on its last legs. And after that, in terms of progress in manned space flight, having 1 operational space station isn't all that much to write home about. The Russians have had space stations since 1971. We've had space stations since 1976. Who cares? Where is the exploration? Orbiting the Earth over and over and over again It's not exploration, and it's a sad commentary, not just on America and NASA, but on the human race generally, that no man has been farther than 500 miles from the Earth since Apollo 17 returned home in December of 72. I was thinking about this today, specifically about my reminiscences from the day of the disaster and the days following. And I remember we came up with a lot of really sick, evil Challenger jokes, because that's what kids do. They make awful jokes about things. But I was only able to remember one of them. And in the interest of full disclosure, here it is. What's the last thing that went through Christa Mcauliffe mind when the space shuttle blew up? Judy Resnick's foot! Here's wishing everyone a splendid weekend. Thanks for watching. See you Monday. Do not comply. Get off my lawn.